October 17th, 1959 began like any other night in New York, but by midnight it would quietly reshape the balance of power in the city's underworld. Bellevue Hospital's emergency room pulsed with tension as doctors moved quickly around a single patient, a man whose name alone inspired fear across 5 boroughs. Vito Genovese, architect of murders, betrayals, and empires, lay helpless on a narrow hospital bed. His skin had lost its color, lips tinged blue, chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Machines beeped in warning rhythms that no amount of money or influence could silence. Nurses whispered. Doctors argued. Outside the room, hardened bodyguards stood stiff, their confidence cracking. This wasn't supposed to happen. Men like Genovese didn't end up like this, poisoned and vulnerable, fighting for life under fluorescent lights. Whatever was happening inside his body was winning, and nobody in that room yet understood how carefully the night had been planned. The lead physician demanded answers with growing urgency, his voice sharp with frustration as vital signs dipped lower. What had Genovese consumed? Drugs? Pills? Chemicals? The bodyguards answered immediately, too quickly, rehearsed without meaning to be. Whiskey. Just whiskey with dinner. Nothing else. No food poisoning, no suspicious substances, no strange behavior. Yet the doctor knew better. Healthy men did not deteriorate this fast without cause. Genovese's heart rate fluttered dangerously as his breathing worsened, oxygen forced through his nose doing little to help. Someone had done this to him. The realization crept into the room like cold air through a cracked window. This wasn't random. This wasn't medical. This was deliberate. Somewhere earlier that night a decision had been made. Somewhere a hand had acted. And now one of the most feared men in America was paying the price, even as his loyal guards swore they had seen nothing out of the ordinary. As doctors worked, the weight of Genovese's reputation hung heavy in the room. This was the man who ordered deaths without blinking, who dismantled rivals with quiet efficiency, who ruled through fear masked as respect. Yet power meant nothing here. Tubes, monitors, and medicine reduced him to what he truly was, mortal. His mind drifted in and out, consciousness slipping as chemicals surged through his bloodstream. Somewhere beneath the haze, panic stirred. Genovese understood poison. He had used it himself. He knew its language, its patience, its cruelty. That knowledge terrified him now. If he had been poisoned, then someone had gotten close, very close. Close enough to share a table, close enough to raise a glass. That narrowed the list to almost nothing, and as the thought formed, fear tightened in his chest, harder than the toxin ever could. 6 hours earlier, the night had looked very different. Warm lights glowed inside a closed Italian restaurant in Little Italy, a place chosen carefully for privacy and control. This was neutral ground in name only. Every waiter, every shadow, every corner belonged to Vito Genovese. The meeting was framed as peace. A civilized discussion between businessmen, but peace meetings in this world often carried coffins hidden beneath tablecloths. Across from Genovese sat Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's undisputed king, calm, observant, silent when silence mattered. Genovese smiled with the confidence of a man convinced the outcome was already secured. He believed this dinner would end a problem permanently. What he didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson had survived his entire life by reading rooms the way other men read newspapers. And from the moment he sat down, Bumpy was watching everything. The whiskey arrived early, poured before real conversation began. Crystal glasses, identical in design, caught the candlelight. Genovese lifted his glass comfortably, the gesture casual, practiced. Bumpy accepted his own but didn't drink. He let the glass rest in front of him, fingers loose, eyes attentive. To anyone else, it was nothing. To Bumpy, it was information. Years of experience sharpened his senses in ways no training ever could. When he finally lifted the glass and angled it slightly toward the light, he saw what others wouldn't. The liquid wasn't right, barely noticeable, almost dismissible, but real. A faint cloudiness disturbed the amber clarity whiskey was supposed to have. In that instant, the entire night revealed itself. The invitation, the privacy, the confidence. Genovese wasn't negotiating. He was executing. Bumpy didn't react. That was the difference between men who survived and men who died. Panic would have killed him faster than poison. He knew refusing the drink outright would raise alarms. Accusations would lead to denials, denials to violence, violence to war. Harlem would burn. Instead, Bumpy did what he had always done best. He thought. He measured time, eyes, distance, behavior. He studied Genovese's glass next, perfectly clear, clean, untouched. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, a slow-acting poison, no scene, no witnesses, just a dead man hours later and plausible confusion. Genovese believed he had already won. That belief would become his weakness. Bumpy understood something crucial in that moment. Survival depended not on escape but reversal. The problem wasn't knowing the danger. The problem was solving it without being seen. Every man in the room was watching him now, whether lie or openly. Bodyguards lingered near doors. The air was thick with quiet threats. Any sudden movement would be interpreted as aggression. Any hesitation would look like fear. Bumpy needed misdirection, something primal enough to pull attention away from the table, something dangerous but controlled. He already had it with him, carried not as a weapon but as a reminder of precision and patience. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket. Instantly, trained instincts flared around the room. Hands moved toward guns. Muscles tightened. Then the razor appeared. Ivory handle, old German steel. Not opened, but unmistakable. Tension exploded. Every eye locked onto the blade, exactly where Bumpy wanted them. The bodyguards reacted as expected. Weapons drawn, voices raised. Chaos hovered one breath away. Genovese stood quickly, commanding his men to stand down, his attention fully on the perceived threat. In those seconds, the room existed only around the razor. That was enough. Bumpy's other hand moved with the smooth confidence of long-practiced sleight of hand. No rush, no wasted motion. Two glasses lifted, crossed, and set down in reversed positions. The movement was invisible because no one was looking for it. That was the genius of it. When the guns lowered and the tension eased, the table looked unchanged. The danger, however, had completely changed direction. Bumpy closed the trap without anyone realizing it had been sprung. Conversation resumed. Apologies were hanged. The razor became a topic of craftsmanship, heritage, fathers. Normalcy returned, or at least its illusion. Genovese relaxed again, convinced control had never left his hands. When the toast came, it felt genuine. Two men raised their glasses. Two men drank. Only one understood what had truly happened. The poison slid down Genovese's throat, unnoticed, unchallenged. Across the table, Bumpy tasted clean whiskey and certainty. He had turned death around with nothing more than observation, timing, and nerve. The rest of the night was already decided, even if Genovese didn't know it yet. Power had shifted quietly, the way it always does when intelligence beats arrogance. Minutes passed, then more. Genovese continued talking, unaware of the clock now ticking inside him. Slowly, subtle changes appeared. Words softened, movements slowed, a missed reach for the glass, a blink held too long. Bumpy watched without staring, concern prepared for performance when needed. When Genovese finally stood and nearly collapsed, the illusion shattered. Bodyguards rushed. Plans dissolved. Dinner ended in emergency. As they carried him out, Bumpy remained behind, calm, intact, invisible in responsibility. The poison had done exactly what it was meant to do, just not to the man it was meant for. Outside, night swallowed the restaurant again, indifferent and quiet, as history took note of a lesson that would echo for decades. The drive to Bellevue Hospital was frantic, sirens slicing through Manhattan traffic as Genovese drifted between awareness and darkness. His bodyguards barked orders, fear now replacing the confidence they carried only hours earlier. This wasn't how things were supposed to unfold. Genovese was meant to leave that restaurant untouched, victorious, his rival eliminated quietly. Instead, his vision blurred, stomach burned, and limbs felt foreign. Somewhere deep inside, suspicion hardened into certainty. Poison. He had used it before. He recognized the betrayal by its symptoms. As the car swerved through intersections, one thought refused to leave him alone. The dinner, the glasses, the calm look on Bumpy Johnson's face. That calm had not been ignorance. It had been control. The realization was terrifying. If Bumpy had known, truly known, then Genovese wasn't the hunter. He was prey who had walked willingly into the snare. Doctors worked aggressively when the car screeched to a stop at Bellevue. Genovese was rushed inside, his name opening doors that money alone could not. Orders were shouted, charts reviewed, stomach pumped. Chemicals were flushed, charcoal administered, 4S pushed into veins. The poison resisted quietly, stubborn but not invincible. As treatment stabilized him, Genovese hovered between sleep and awareness, trapped with his thoughts. Every memory of the dinner replayed with brutal clarity. The whiskey, the toast, the razor. That razor wouldn't leave his mind. It had been theatrical, unnecessary on the surface. Now he understood it differently. It wasn't a threat, it was a tool, a distraction. The kind only a man confident in his intelligence would dare use. That realization wounded Genovese more deeply than the poison. He had misjudged his enemy, and in this world, misjudgment was unforgivable. At 11:47 p.m., the door to Genovese's hospital room opened quietly. No announcement, no urgency, just the sound of controlled footsteps. Genovese's eyes opened wider as he recognized the man walking toward him. Bumpy Johnson looked exactly as he had at dinner, composed, precise, untouched by the chaos of the night. In his hand was a familiar whiskey glass, unmistakably from the restaurant. Bumpy placed it gently on the nightstand, close enough that Genovese couldn't ignore it. Then he produced the razor, slowly, deliberately, letting the meaning settle. No words were needed. The truth assembled itself with cruel elegance. The switch, the misdirection, the poison meant for another now sitting inside his own veins. Bumpy didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He simply allowed understanding to do its work. That silence was the loudest sound in the room. Genovese tried to speak, his throat raw, voice barely functional. "How?" was all he could manage. Bumpy leaned slightly closer, his tone calm, almost instructional. Harlem wasn't for sale. Not now, not ever. It wasn't a warning, it was a conclusion. Years of ambition collapsed into that sentence. Genovese understood the cost of this lesson instantly. Retaliation, woe. Old, mean war. And war meant attention. Attention meant law enforcement, federal pressure, losses he could not afford. Worse, war against Bumpy Johnson would be unpredictable. The man standing before him had proven that intelligence could dismantle power without violence. That kind of enemy was far more dangerous than one who relied on guns. Genovese nodded faintly. An unspoken agreement formed, sealed not with contracts or blood, but with humiliation and survival. When Bumpy left the hospital room, the bodyguards outside watched him carefully. They had seen him dine with their boss. Now they saw him leave while Genovese lay broken inside. None stopped him. None asked questions they already feared the answers to. The elevator doors closed, carrying Bumpy away as if nothing remarkable had happened. Inside the room, Genovese stared at the glass beside his bed. Nurses offered to remove it. He refused. He needed the reminder. Power had limits. Confidence could be weaponized against you. For 4 days that glass remained. 4 days of reflection. 4 days of understanding that Harlem was no longer a prize to be won. It was a boundary enforced not by armies, but by a man who noticed details others dismissed. When Genovese was discharged, he returned to New Jersey quieter than before. Meetings were called. Plans were canceled. Harlem operations were shelved permanently. His lieutenants questioned the decision, confused by the sudden retreat. Genovese offered no explanation beyond a simple truth: Bumpy Johnson was different. Some lessons could only be learned once. Rumors spread, as they always did. Poison, trickery, magic. The truth was less dramatic and far more dangerous. Intelligence had beaten ambition. Observation had beaten arrogance. In the underworld, that story traveled fast. It reshaped reputations. It cemented Bumpy Johnson's status not just as a boss, but as a strategist who could dismantle enemies without leaving fingerprints. Years later, younger men would ask how Bumpy had survived so long in a world built on violence. The answer was always the same. He paid attention. He never assumed. Fear didn't paralyze him, it sharpened him. He understood that most men failed not because they lacked courage, but because they stopped thinking under pressure. The night of the poison proved that better than any gunfight ever could. Bumpy had walked into a death trap and turned it inside out with timing and nerve. No bullets fired, no blood spilled. Just a lesson delivered so cleanly that even his enemy was forced to respect it. As the years passed, the story evolved into legend. Details shifted, names changed, but the core remained untouched. A cloudy glass, a razor. 3 seconds of misdirection, Harlem stayed independent. Bumpy's reputation grew not through violence, but through restraint and intellect. Even those who hated him respected him. Even those who wanted him dead thought twice. In the underworld, Unpredictability was power. Bumpy Johnson embodied that truth. He wasn't untouchable because no one tried. He was untouchable because every attempt underestimated him. Toward the end of his life, Bumpy shared the truth with Frank Lucas, not as a boast, but as instruction. Fear is useful, he said. Panic is deadly. Intelligence is survival. When someone tries to poison you, don't react emotionally. Think, observe, turn their confidence against them. That lesson outlived both men. It echoed through Harlem and beyond, a quiet rule understood by those who lasted. Violence may win battles, but intelligence decides who remains standing when the night is over. Frank Lucas listened carefully as Bumpy spoke, the afternoon light filtering through the office above Small's paradise. By then, Bumpy's voice carried the weight of decades, slower but still precise. Frank had heard the rumors for years. Exaggerated versions passed through street corners and back rooms. But this was different. This was instruction, not mythology. Bumpy didn't frame the story as bravery. He framed it as discipline. He explained how most men fail not because they lack strength, but because they lose control of their thoughts under pressure. Fear floods the mind, shortcuts replace logic, and mistakes multiply. That night with Genovese was never about courage. It was about restraint. The cloudy whiskey mattered only because Bumpy allowed himself to notice it. Most men would have swallowed it without a second glance. Awareness, Bumpy said, is the real advantage. Everything else comes after. Frank asked whether Bumpy had been afraid walking into that restaurant, knowing Genovese's reputation. Bumpy smiled, the same restrained smile that unsettled people who knew him well. Of course he was afraid. Fear was unavoidable. The mistake most men made was believing fear should disappear before action. Fear never disappears. It informs, it sharpens. The danger comes when fear controls behavior instead of guiding it. At the table, Bumpy had felt fear clearly. That clarity forced him to slow down rather than rush. It forced him to look closely instead of acting impulsively. When he saw the cloudiness in the glass, fear didn't tell him to fight. It told him to think. That distinction, Bumpy explained, was the difference between dying young and living long in their world. Bumpy described the razor not as a weapon, but as a piece of theater. Violence, he explained, was loud and predictable. Theater confused people. Confusion created opportunity. He had carried that razor for years, not because he planned to use it, but because it symbolized patience and craftsmanship. That night, it served its purpose perfectly. The moment it appeared, instinct took over in the room. Bodyguards reacted automatically. Genovese reacted emotionally. Everyone stopped thinking. That pause was the opening. 3 seconds were enough. Timing mattered more than speed. A rushed movement draws attention. A calm one disappears. Frank absorbed this quietly, understanding that the lesson extended far beyond that single night. Bumpy emphasized that the real victory wasn't Genovese drinking the poison. The real victory was preventing a war. Killing Genovese would have solved nothing. Power vacuums invite chaos, retaliation, and scrutiny. Harlem would have suffered. Innocent people would have paid the price. By allowing Genovese to live, Bumpy forced him to retreat voluntarily. Humiliation, when delivered correctly, was more effective than death. It left the enemy alive but restrained, constantly aware of their own vulnerability. That awareness changed behavior permanently. Genovese never forgot that night, and because he never forgot it, he never tried again. That outcome required patience, not rage. Control, not ego. Frank asked whether Genovese ever tried subtle revenge later. Bumpy shook his head. Men who truly understand a loss don't repeat it. Genovese wasn't foolish. He knew exactly how close he had come to death and how completely the situation had been reversed. Retaliation would have meant admitting weakness to others. Silence was safer. Distance was smarter. Harlem remained untouched not because of treaties, but because fear and respect had been recalibrated. Bumpy explained that reputations weren't built through constant violence. They were built through moments people talked about for decades. The poison story survived because it proved something deeper. Intelligence could dominate brute power without spectacle. As Bumpy spoke, Frank realized the lesson applied beyond crime. Power anywhere followed similar rules. People assumed authority meant control. In reality, control came from understanding behavior, incentives, and perception. Genovese had controlled territory through force, but Bumpy controlled situations through insight. That made him unpredictable. Unpredictability created hesitation. Hesitation saved lives. Frank understood why Bumpy had survived while so many others hadn't. He wasn't reckless, he was methodical. He didn't chase dominance. He protected stability. That mindset would shape Frank's future decisions more than any gunfight or confrontation ever could. Bumpy paused, his energy fading slightly, but his eyes remained sharp. He told Frank that the underworld punished arrogance relentlessly. Genovese's mistake wasn't attempting poison. Poison was smart. His mistake was assuming Bumpy wouldn't notice. That assumption revealed disrespect. In their world, disrespect was always fatal, even when delayed. The poisoned night became a quiet checkpoint in criminal history, not because of bloodshed, but because it demonstrated restraint as strength. Harlem stayed Harlem. Italian power stopped at its borders. That boundary lasted not through violence, but through memory. Frank left that conversation changed. The story wasn't inspirational in a heroic sense. It was instructional in a survival sense. He understood that intelligence wasn't optional, it was mandatory. Observation wasn't passive, it was active defense. The lesson wasn't about poison or razors or whiskey, it was about awareness under pressure. That awareness, once mastered, could turn almost any trap against the person who said it. Years later, long after both men were gone, the story would still circulate, not as gossip, but as warning. The names might fade, the locations might blur, but the principle remained intact. When you underestimate someone who is paying attention, you don't just lose, you educate your enemy, and once that happens, you never truly recover. In the years following the poison incident, Harlem moved with a quiet confidence that outsiders noticed but rarely understood. There were no victory parades, no public declarations of independence, no need for spectacle. The power balance had shifted silently, and silence itself became enforcement. Italian crews stopped probing north. Informants whispered that orders had come from above to stay clear. No one explained why. They didn't need to. Fear works best when it's undefined. Bumpy Johnson continued running Harlem the same way he always had, steady and controlled, ensuring money flowed without chaos and violence stayed purposeful rather than reckless. To those inside the system, life felt strangely stable for such a dangerous business. Stability, Bumpy believed, was the true mark of control. Anyone could create fear with bloodshed. Few could create order without it. Law enforcement noticed the calm as well. Federal agents had expected retaliation, flare-ups, something they could exploit. Instead, nothing happened. No bodies, no sudden shifts. Just an invisible line that no one crossed. Investigators suspected deals but could never find proof. Bumpy understood something most criminals didn't. Attention was poison of its own kind. The less noise you made, the longer you lasted. Genovese's retreat reinforced that philosophy. Even when rumors circulated, Bumpy never corrected them. Let people believe whatever frightened them most. The truth was less dramatic but more dangerous. Harlem was protected by perception, not firepower. That made it resilient in ways outsiders struggled to counter. Genovese, meanwhile, carried the incident like a private scar. Publicly, he remained powerful. Privately, his confidence had limits now. He knew how close he had come to dying by his own design. He knew how easily control could slip when intelligence met arrogance. When younger mobsters asked about Harlem, his answers were short and final. Stay out. Some mistook that for caution, others mistook it for weakness. Only a few recognized it for what it was, experience. Genovese had learned that not all enemies could be crushed. Some could only be respected or avoided. That realization isolated him slightly within his own world, but it also kept him alive longer than reckless pride would have. Stories about Bumpy Johnson evolved as stories always do. Some painted him as mystical, others as impossibly lucky. Neither was true. He was observant. He listened more than he spoke. He trusted details over assumptions. Those qualities don't translate easily into legend, so people replaced them with exaggeration. The razor became symbolic, the poison became dramatic, but the real lesson stayed hidden beneath the noise. Intelligence, when applied calmly under pressure, could neutralize threats without escalation. That lesson frightened people far more than tales of violence ever could. Young men entering the underworld learned quickly that Harlem was different. Rules were enforced quietly, Disrespect was addressed decisively but rarely publicly. Bumpy didn't need constant displays of dominance. His reputation did the work for him. The poison story became shorthand for that reputation. You didn't need to know every detail. You only needed to know how it ended. That was enough to keep most people cautious. In a world built on bravado, caution was rare. Harlem benefited from that rarity. As the 1960s progressed, pressure from federal authorities increased everywhere. Arrests mounted, informants multiplied, empires weakened. Bumpy aged, his health declining, but his influence remained intact. Even those preparing for succession understood the standard he had set. Survival wasn't about aggression, it was about anticipation. When rivals failed, it was usually because they confused fearlessness with recklessness. Bumpy had never made that mistake. The Poison Night remained the clearest proof of his philosophy in action. Frank Lucas carried those lessons with him as he rose. He applied them differently, sometimes imperfectly, but the core remained. Pay attention. Question appearances. Never assume safety. The memory of Bumpy describing the cloudy whiskey stayed vivid. One small detail noticed at the right moment could rewrite destiny. That idea shaped decisions far beyond Harlem. Long after Genovese's power faded and the old structures crumbled, the story endured, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. Precision is memorable. It suggests control. People respect control even when they don't understand it. The poison story survived because it demonstrated mastery rather than chaos. By the time Bumpy's era drew to a close, Harlem's independence was no longer questioned. It had become accepted reality, not enforced by violence but by precedent. Precedent is difficult to challenge. It feels inevitable. And inevitability in the underworld is the closest thing to permanence. Those who studied power later would point to moments like that dinner in Little Italy as turning points. Not for the spectacle, but for the restraint. Power that knows when not to strike often outlasts power that strikes too often. Bumpy Johnson understood that long before others did, and the Poison Night was simply the clearest demonstration. In his final years, Bumpy Johnson moved more slowly, but his mind never dulled. Those close to him noticed that he spoke less about power and more about awareness. He understood that legacy in his world wasn't measured by territory alone, but by lessons that survived after death. The poison incident remained his clearest example, not because it was clever, but because it was controlled. He hadn't acted out of anger or pride, he had acted out of calculation. That distinction mattered. Many men could pull a trigger, very few could restrain themselves long enough to see the entire board. Bumpy knew restraint was invisible strength, and invisible strength lasted longer than fear driven by violence. When news eventually spread that Genovese had died years later in federal prison, there was no celebration in Harlem, no satisfaction. His death wasn't relevant anymore. The conflict had ended the night of the poisoned whiskey. Everything afterward was consequence. That quiet conclusion said more about Bumpy's dominance than any public victory could have. He had resolved the threat without creating a cycle. Cycles destroy empires. Resolution preserves them. Harlem had remained intact because the problem had been closed cleanly, not inflamed. Those who came after often misunderstood the lesson. They focused on the trick, not the mindset. They wanted shortcuts, dramatic moments, symbols without substance. Bumpy warned against that thinking. Intelligence wasn't a move, it was a habit. You couldn't borrow it once and expect it to save you forever. You had to live inside it, observe constantly, assume nothing, respect danger without surrendering to it. That philosophy applied everywhere, not just in crime. It was how power functioned in any system where stakes were high and mistakes were permanent. Even decades later, the poison story remained unusually consistent. Details rarely changed. That consistency gave it weight. Most underworld stories grow louder and messier over time. This one stayed sharp. 2 glasses, 1 razor, 1 mistake, 1 man paying attention. That clarity made it instructional rather than mythical. People remembered it not because it was flashy, but because it felt real. Real stories last longer than exaggerated ones. For Harlem, the incident became a quiet point of pride, not because it involved humiliation of another man, but because it demonstrated sophistication. It proved that intelligence and discipline existed there just as much as anywhere else. That mattered in a city that often underestimated it. The lesson wasn't about domination. It was about equality through competence. Harlem didn't EEDD permission. It earned respect by enforcing boundaries intelligently. Bumpy's death closed a chapter, but not the book. The standards he set continued to influence behavior long after his voice was gone. Men still referenced his methods when discussing survival, not violence, method, precision, timing, awareness. The Poison Night condensed all of that into a single moment people could understand. History often celebrates explosions, shootouts, and chaos. It rarely pauses for quiet victories, yet quiet victories shape outcomes more permanently. The night Bumpy Johnson noticed a cloudy whiskey was one of those moments. No headlines, no witnesses willing to talk, just a shift in reality that never reversed. Genovese learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Others learned it secondhand. Most never learned it at all. They mistook noise for power and speed for intelligence. Those men rarely lasted. The underworld, like any competitive system, rewards clarity more than bravado. In the end, the story endures because it is simple. Pay attention. Think before you react. Never assume the other man isn't watching. Intelligence doesn't announce itself. It waits, and when it moves, it ends things cleanly. That is why the Poison Night is remembered, not as a tale of revenge, but as proof that survival belongs to the observant.